All right, welcome back, everybody. It's never nice being told that you're looking a bit green just before you're about to come on air. Come on, guys, can't tell me I look green yet. All right, let's forget about the color green and move to this story, which, of course, is a big one. Earlier this week, Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan appointed Jabu Mabuza to be Eskom's acting CEO. Now, the position has been vacant since the resignation of Phakamani Hadebe, whose tenure ended in July. The appointment has raised corporate governance of whether this constitutes a conflict of interests. Xolani Mpahlwa, a governance, risk and compliance specialist, joins us from our Pretoria studios. Xolani, good to have you. Thanks so much for being with us here on Morning Live.
Morning.
So let's get your view straight up on the appointment of Jabu Mabuza, who is, of course, the board chair and doubles up as well as the acting CEO.
Yes, so I very much feel the feeling the public has in terms of thinking that the appointment may be causing some concerns. In terms of Companies Act, there is no breach of law because the Company Act allows the CEO to be a chairman. But the issue is governance. King 4 states that the chairman office must not be occupied by the same person. The CEO cannot be occupying the office as chairman. So I think this is where, on the governance aspect, we are concerned as a public, and that's where the outcry probably comes from.
Yeah, and this is a very, very major issue because we start seeing these comments coming in from the governance body and basically saying that having the chair, which is Jabu Mabuza, also serve as the power utility. This falls short of best practice guidelines, which is outlined in Judge Mervyn King's reports on corporate governance. And this is all according to the CEO of the Institute of Directors of Southern Africa. And it is a big warning sign that goes out there. What do you believe was the rationale behind doing something like this, appointing him in both of these positions, albeit an acting position?
Okay, Leanne, I think, like you said, originally, you would want to have the CEO reporting to the chairman of the board, who is accountable to the shareholder, which is in this case the ministry. And obviously, between the board and the ministry, the shareholders' compact indicates what is the expectation from the board performance point of view. And then the board is accountable to ensure they delegate the relevant authority to the CEO, who is doing the executive day-to-day running of the entity. So I think the concern obviously here lies with the separation of duties and the impartiality, the objectivity, the independence, and the judgments that will be made by a CEO who is also a chairman. Yeah. And I think it does also go back to the board. In terms of governance, there's Principle 7, which talks to the diverse skills that are required to have by the board. So you would naturally have a board that consists of various set of skills, so that in the event of us coming to an environment like Eskom has come to, we would be able to deploy someone from the board to take over the position of the CEO in an interim duration. And unfortunately, it seems like at Eskom there wasn't sufficient diversity in terms of skills of the board. And also, probably the question should be, why wasn't there anyone else from the board that wanted to occupy the CEO position instead of the chairman? So there are dynamics that may have happened in terms of the availability internally within the board or within the organization to nominate someone to act in the position.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the roles of a chairman of a board and the CEO of a company, I mean, the ideal basically is that the chair leads the board in an oversight position and then a CEO is in the managerial role. I mean, that is a very loose definition of what the roles are. But now, I mean, when we look at, for instance, the results that were released this week from Eskom, where we saw under Jabu Mabuza, who was the chairman of the board, I mean, the company literally putting out there a 20 billion rand loss. Now, you know, now as the acting CEO, who's actually accountable for all of this? I mean, this is where the line becomes very, very dimmed.
But also, Leanne, I think one of the other things we should take into consideration is that there might have not been someone who would put up his hand naturally inside the organization to take over the position because perhaps of its exposure to political arena and perhaps also of its challenges in terms of, like you mentioned now, the loss of the revenue in terms of the figure of 20 billion odd. So someone may say this is too challenging, they are afraid to take up the position, and perhaps we ended up having Mr. Jabu Mabuza saying, I will lead the organization in the interim. And we have to note that Eskom, this is not the first time it has been in this predicament. 2009, Mr. Mpahlwa had to take over Eskom through Barbara Hogan, who was the minister at the time, when Mr. Maroka resigned. And it's a similar scenario that we're finding ourselves 10 years later almost. Similarly, Mr. Tsediso, when he left, you had a vacuum of leadership at Eskom. 3 executives were not there. And you had Mr. Zola Tsotsi as a chairman leaving. And this also gives us an indication that the issue of corporate governance needs to be reviewed by many of entities outside Eskom because it talks to a lack of succession planning. Principles are telling us that in terms of corporate governance, there should be a succession planning in terms of when the CE leaves, the board is tasked with the role of finding a replacement within due time. And that is a requirement in terms of corporate governance, in terms of disclosures. So in the event of Eskom, there seems to have been a lack of implementing this effectively in due time over the years. And I think that is the vacuum we have in the country at large in terms of succession planning and leadership.
Just finally, I mean, you've raised some very, very important issues here, but the justification that went into this appointment, considering Mabuza's chairmanship and also considering the position that Eskom finds itself in, and many speaking to the fact that this would probably be the best solution to put him in as an interim CEO until they find a new one because he was the best person for the job. I mean, is this a loophole that you can get around? And I mean, the question really needs to be asked, are we breaking any governance or corporate principles by doing this?
As I said, Leanne, in terms of law, there's no breach, but in terms of governance, it's absolutely a no-go zone. It should have not been happening as it had happened before in 2009. It is something that we should have circumvented and mitigated in terms of risk. And it goes back to the profiling of leaders that occupy these positions. It goes back to the policies in terms of talent management, the talent pool at Eskom, internally and also from externally. So I think you would not get into this situation if really we had good exposure to talent management, to succession planning, to profiling the CEO leadership positions that we find ourselves. Unfortunately, we have to do this one because it's an interim period. It's 3 months. Therefore, we can allow it to happen because, in a sense, Mr. Jabu Mabuza is the only one, apparently, at this point, who would have been longer with the board, who had exposure to the inner dealings of Eskom, and therefore it can allow the situation that he is best placed at this interim position.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you. Thanks, Xolani, for talking to us here on the program. Xolani Mpahlwa, a governance, risk and compliance specialist, discussing corporate governance principles on the Jabu Mabuza Eskom matter, where there's a conflict of interest when the chairperson of a company also assumes the role of the CEO.